think people will be. So now we're going to move into the Just Transition Project discussion, exploring the strategic case for investor action. And we are very blessed to have with us today Vonda Brunsting, who is the program manager for the Just Transition Project at the Initiative for Responsible Investment. Vonda also co-founded the Trustee Leadership Forum for Retirement Security at IRI. And before joining IRI, she was the Director of Capital Stewardship Program for SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, which was created to foster engagement with capital markets and financial institutions. Vonda's also worked as a community organizer, and you'll see that, I'm sure, in her remarks today. She's been in Chicago, New York, and Boston with the Industrial Areas Foundation. And so with that, I will turn it over to Vonda, wherever she is. There she is. Thank you. Take it away.
Okay. All right. So,
and really, I mean, it's quite an amazing thing to be the last person. Had a long day starting at 8 o'clock today. So hats off to you.
Okay,
well, thank you very much.
Hats off to everybody for staying. And I think we'll try to go through this really quickly. I just have to make the note that I'm talking really about the S, or a way to sort of combine the E and the S in ESG. And it's often sort of overlooked, and I think hopefully being the end of the day with a short amount of time means that the next time we do this conference, we can have the bulk of the time on the S and the shortest time on some of the other issues that we heard about today. But I am really pleased to talk about the Just Transition. How many people in the room have heard the concept before, Just Transition? Okay, so a vast improvement from a year ago when I would speak with people and nobody had ever heard of it. It is in the Paris Accord, and so if you're signed up to move the Paris goals, you're already signed up to the Just Transition. But it's really, what we're really talking about is how you look at the social dimension of climate change. And I think that for me, working in the field of in and around investment for the last 15 years and in and around the labor movement for the last 15 years, it's really a chance to think about how do we bring those two together. So I often think about these sort of two sides of myself. I sit here at the Crowne Plaza talking with the investor community, and yet for the past 15 years, I've also worked just down the street before moving to the Harvard Kennedy School at 1199, the Healthcare Workers Union in New York. So all the folks who work in hospitals in New York are members of our union with a pension fund. I worked for the International Union, which was based in Washington, D.C., even though my desk was here. And I managed a program where we worked with the fiduciaries of our public and private pension plans. So SEIU, the Service Employees Union, has 2 million members. And they're in, their retirement savings are in CalPERS. They're in the NYSERS plan. They're in New York Common. They're in the main pension fund, in the Washington fund that you just heard from. And so we're often thinking about what are the impacts of what's happening in our world on their retirement security, right? They're concerned about their investments, but also what's happening to their jobs, what's happening to the nature of work as we shift to a low carbon economy. We have 2 partners on our project. I'm now at the Harvard Kennedy School at the Initiative for Responsible Investment. My colleague David Wood is here in the back of the room. We're working with the London School of Economics and the Grantham Research Institute, along with the Principles for Responsible Investment and the International Trade Union Confederation. And so we conceived of this project a year and a half ago, partly because we were reeling from, honestly, the 2016 election, Brexit. And since then, Yellow Vest movement in France, and the list goes on. There's been a lot of political dislocation, and our work on climate has faced a setback from what's happening on the ground. And so if we don't feel the need to consider the just transition, I think it's being forced upon us. We're not going to be able to meet our climate goals unless we consider the impacts on workers and communities. So we then picked up an agenda, sort of leading off of what governments are doing on the just transition. There's been efforts underway in Scotland and Canada, at the EU and Australia, and said, okay, well, what could investors do? And so over the last year and a half, we started with a discussion paper, which is what we do, and then we moved into a toolkit, and now we're looking at how do we integrate the just transition across the portfolio. And so just to give you a sense of how far we've come in a short amount of time, we've picked up this effort to look at the social dimension. Investors have lined up behind the agenda. With PRI, we launched last year in December at COP an investor statement for support of the just transition, which saw 142 investors with $8 trillion in assets under management say, yes, we want to figure this out with you. So I think there's some momentum there. We're putting together an international community of practice. And we've come up with 5 things that investors can do. And it's really based on starting with what you're already doing, not reinventing the wheel, picking up those standards and those practices that are already in place in your portfolio. And then I would say, frankly, just borrowing and working with others to take what they're doing and putting it in your own portfolio. So on these 5 strategies, just to go through a couple of them quickly, your investment strategy. How do you include the social dimension in your strategy? Just to give you an example, Ircontech, which is a French fund, is looking at intergenerational solidarity and building it into their investment policy statement. So take a look at that. See how someone is doing it. The Dutch funds are picking up a transition kind of lens across their portfolio. They're trying to figure this out. I think we can learn from each other. Investor engagement, again, there's tons of engagement happening. We've been hearing about it all week. We don't need to start another engagement platform. We have them. We're working with Climate Action 100+, which you've already heard about. Just transition is in their framing. Now we need to figure out what are those questions that we're going to ask companies around the just transition. How do we build these norms into the practices of the companies and build on the traditions they already have? Easier in countries where there's a practice of social dialogue, but how do we engage with our workforce? And what is our role as asset managers and asset owners in that? We heard a great story from PSP just now about bringing all the infrastructure managers in the room and saying, what are the health and safety standards that you abide by and you practice, and what are the challenges that you're facing? So again, how can we do this and learn from each other? Capital allocation, again, we heard today a great example from the Danish pension funds on infrastructure and on wind. They went into this 10 years ago or more, and are looking at how they can see the investment opportunities in the renewable sector. And then as we do that, how do we make sure that those are good jobs, right? So it's just not a matter of saying, well, we're going to switch from coal mines to wind farms. It sounds nice. We could just take the workers from one and bring them into the other. But frankly, some of those coal jobs they're good in the sense that they pay well. You've seen, or we've seen, a workforce in Canada that's gone from the east coast of Canada. They commute to Alberta to work in the tar sands because they're good jobs, not because they want to fly across the country and leave their family, but they can raise those families on the wages that they earn in 6 months. And so how do we make those solar jobs and those wind farm jobs equally sustainable for folks to live on? And right now, in the solar industry, they're $12 to $15 an hour. That's not sustainable. That's not something that's going to give people a way to provide for their families, send their kids to college. And so that's a dilemma, I think, that we're facing as we think about a shift from the oil and gas and the sort of the high carbon intensive jobs to the renewable sector. And then the policy dialogue. So this is a huge challenge for investors because I don't think that we see ourselves as having a clearly defined role on policy discussions. I think it's shifting. We heard from PRI about the inevitable policy response, and I think that there's work being done to think about what's our voice, what's our role as investors in the debates that are taking place, and we need to be there. It's not really a matter of saying, well, okay, we know how to talk to the SEC about corporate governance issues. We do, and we will continue to do that. Our voices need to be heard. But more broadly speaking, as we sort of see, and as Hiro Mizuma mentioned before, how this sort of systemic risk is implicating us, it's not something that we can take a back seat on when we look at how we are global investors, long-term investors. We need to be part of those debates that are happening in our capital buildings. and get ourselves into rooms where we can line up with policymakers and figure out how we create a more sustainable future. So I think I'm just going to talk really briefly for a minute and see if people have questions. Just to say that we want to have this be a very active agenda. We don't want to, I mean, we do reports. I think over the last 8 hours, I've heard at least 12 reports mentioned. I think we all need a couple of days just to kind of sit and read them. But we also want to build a whole new way of operating as investors. And there's a couple of resources if you want more reports to add to those 10 or 12. You can find them on our website. And I can share my contact information if you want it, but oops, I'll just go back to that then. But I guess the thing that I want to leave you with, the pithy statement that I've heard people ask for, is that we need to think about how we're creating new tables of engagement. So we are used to engaging companies. Great, let's do that. Let's sit across the table from boards of directors. But how do we sit across tables from workers, from our beneficiaries, from communities that are impacted by the way and the manner in which we invest? How do we bring governments into those places as well? Investors don't sort of see themselves, and maybe we're not comfortable at those tables. And maybe it's good for us to be uncomfortable. Maybe we need to get out into the workplace. Great to invite people into your office building. Maybe it's here in Midtown Manhattan. But what would it look like if you went to the Union Hall, if you went to the church basement, if you went to the community where the coal-fired plant is about to be shuttered and had those discussions with people? What's the role of an investor in either creating those tables or being part of those discussions? And maybe sometimes it means sitting back and listening and not always having the answers. So I think that it's hard because there's been like a flood of information that we've heard about from all day to figure out where to start. But I would say start with two things. Sign on to the investor statement on the just transition because it gives you a chance to talk about it with your board, with your beneficiaries, with your asset managers. It's a good document, 2 pages. It just gives you a way to talk. And then think about how to be involved locally, right? We think that the just transition is going to be informed by place. It's going to happen in, not in New York City, but in Ithaca. It's going to happen, well, probably in both. It's going to happen in Yorkshire, in the UK, and in London. It's going to happen in Johannesburg. And those discussions that take place on the ground in local geographies are a place that need investors, right? They need you to be scoping for investment opportunities, but they also need you to listen to the fear, perhaps, from workers and from communities as we transition, and to also be part of that dialogue with governments as we think about how our investments can make a difference. So I think with that, I will see if we have time for questions or talk to me over at the bar.
The microphone. Thank you. Please stand up and we'll have a microphone running to you.
Hi, Brad Goss, Fossil Free Indexes. I think unlike many people here, I've been a oil deck roughneck working on the rigs and drilling for gas and oil. So I am wondering, after all these years, though, why there's still such a substantial difference in pay scales in working in traditional energy fields and working in alternative energy technologies.
Well, I come from a labor movement, and part of the way we built some of these industries into good-paying jobs was they had a union. Right? So in New York City, I work for SEIU. One of our locals here is 32BJ. It represents doormen and the maintenance workers in buildings. My neighbors in Brooklyn are constantly asking me for jobs, right? Why? Because you want to be a doorman? Well, because it's a good paying job. Why is it a good paying job? Because they have a union, right? So I think that part of what we see in the US is this fragmentation of labor. We've been sort of despise is probably not too strong of a word, but there has to be a way for workers to have a voice on the job, and it's collective bargaining or it's some other association that allows them to actually work together so that they're not the ones who are just on the receiving end where they're being extracted from at the end of the day. How do we push costs down? Well, the gig economy is showing us that as well, right? Those workers on the front line for Uber and Lyft and TaskRabbit and DoorDash, they're not making a decent living, right? There's frustration out there. So how are we as an economy, how are we investing in companies in the tech sector when the workplace is so fragmented? It's something that we have to figure out.
Dan?
Hey, are there examples Are there any good examples, because I know you and David have done some great work in this area internationally or in the US where, I mean, I think of Ulico or others where union pension funds have been able to drive the model forward with some of the investments they're making that have a little just transition, a little sustainability and the right wages? Or are there any new stories to tell?
Yeah, so one of our favorite projects is it's more like what we would know as a 401k fund in Quebec, the Solidarity Funds. And they actually invest in economic development in the province of Quebec, taking workers and members or being a pooled capital for retirement savings. And they're thinking about their investments, you know, in wastewater management or in electric buses as sort of a part of a just transition. They're also embedded in the workplace and also with the companies. So it's possible, I guess it goes back to what I was saying about thinking about this locally and geographically. It's a good model for how you can actually make a return, invest people's retirement savings well, include them in the process, invest in good jobs, right, around a just transition, around a renewable vision. So I think there are others too, but that's one that I would point you to if you want to learn more.
I think we should.
Okay.
Maybe we should wrap it up?
All right.
All right. Thank you. Well,